Okay. Last couple periods, we've talked about the Family Medical Leave Act. We've talked about military leave. And so we've been, and we're going to complete, and this will do this unit on job protection laws. Okay, and there's certain laws out there that we've been discussing over the past few weeks or whatever that protect the employee, whether it be from physical harm, if you will, with regard to laws like OSHA, or protect their jobs, if you will, or their benefits. And I want to conclude by this particular unit with this, with what we call COBRA coverage, right? And just give you, and COBRA is another one of those laws that we could spend probably 3 hours getting into the little details and nuances of, but give you the basics, and then we'll move on, and the basics maybe more than you want anyway. But when we talk about COBRA coverage, what is COBRA coverage? Any idea, Amanda?
It extends the insurance when someone is fired or let go of a job.
Yeah, when somebody loses their job, all right, COBRA coverage steps in and says, we know that you've just lost your insurance. So we're going to, this COBRA is a law to protect that employee or their dependent or spouse, if you will, to make sure that they have continuation of their health insurance coverage. And we call it COBRA continuation coverage. Now, just so that you can have it, but you will never ever hear me refer to it this way again, it is the Consolidated Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. I'm not going to refer to it again, so if you didn't get it, no, I will. It's the Consolidated Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. And that's where COBRA rights are. It's a lot easier to say COBRA, okay? So that's what people say. And that's what, if you see on the test COBRA, instead of it spelled out, you know what it is, okay? Because I won't refer to it as that Consolidated Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. But basically, it requires employers to, or covered employers, those employers who are covered, that have group plans to continue that health coverage for people who may have lost their coverage. All right. The number, it does have an employer coverage provision. It is 20 or more employees on more than 50% of a typical business day. Don't you love it? All these laws that, each one has different requirements, and they calculate them differently. Whereas Family Medical Leave Act, by way of review, has how many?
21.
50 or more in a 75-mile radius. Okay. However, when you get to that 50 or more, how do you calculate the 50 or more, Amanda?
What was it, 21?
20 or more weeks.
20 more weeks.
Yeah, 20 calendar weeks is basically what you're looking at. Here, they look at whether the employer had 20 or more employers 50% of the time. And that's in the previous year. Okay? So, give you a situation. If you have an employer who had 20 or more 50% of the time in the prior year, then for the following year, even if they drop below that 20 or more number, they still have to provide it for those who would have qualified the first time. Okay? So it's a situation where it can change, but generally doesn't fluctuate that much, but you can have it fluctuate. So 20 or more employees on more than 50% basis in the previous calendar year. Okay. It applies to most group health plans. However, it does not apply to federal, state, or local government plans. So it does not apply to federal, state, and local government plans. It does not apply to medical savings accounts. By the way, somebody help me out. What's a medical savings account?
Health savings account.
Health savings account, basically you can put away so much money and then draw down from that. The idea is, and I know this from experience, because when Addison was diagnosed with his epilepsy, we had just set up a medical savings account. And what happens is, you, rather than pay so much for a premium as you go along, you put money aside, but that's your deductible too. I mean, and it was like $6,000 or $7,000 in our medical savings account, because we thought we had pretty healthy kids and everything was going along well. Turned out, once he had his diagnosis, then it was, wow, we got a deductible of $6,000 as opposed to a deductible of $500. It's basically how it turned out. So it does not apply to medical savings accounts, okay? And it does not apply to plans that cover only long-term care services, so like nursing homes. Really what you're talking about on COBRA is your basic major medical, basic health insurance plan. In order to have COBRA, you have to be what is called a qualified beneficiary. In order to have COBRA, you have to be what is called a qualified beneficiary. And here's the definition. A qualified beneficiary is one who is enrolled in the group health plan on the day before a qualifying event. And I'll give you what those qualifying events are. But a qualified beneficiary is an individual who is enrolled in a group health plan on the day before a qualifying event. All right? So, what might be an example of a qualified beneficiary? That's a poorly worded question. Employees, let's do it this way. Employees are qualified beneficiaries. Let me give you that, okay? Who else might be a qualified beneficiary? Okay, spouse, okay. Dependent. Former spouses, maybe. You'll see why in a little bit. Sometimes deceased employees, spouses, maybe, depending upon the policy. And sometimes retired employees or their spouses. Okay. Those generally are going to be the covered or qualified beneficiaries. Okay. Now, let's talk about qualified events. A qualifying event. So you have COBRA coverage, you got qualified beneficiaries, you have qualified events. A qualified event is an event that causes loss of some or all of the group health plan benefits. So a qualified event is an event that causes a loss of some or all of the group health plan benefits. What might be an example where you would lose group health plan benefits? What do you have to do to qualify for group health plan benefits? And it may be unfair to ask questions of students but Lisa.
Would it be if you work full-time and then go to part-time?
Yeah. A lot of plans have an hour requirement, minimum hour requirement, okay? So that you have to be a full-time employee. All right? And if you're a full-time employee, and we talked about that a couple weeks ago, what the definition was, and it can vary from plan to plan. But if you're an employer whose plan says you have to be, and most of them don't require 40 hours, by the way. Most of them require more than 30, 32, but don't require 40. Not all, but it's up to the plan. But if you're a plan that has 32 or more, makes you a qualified person, then if you drop below say 32, you're not going to be qualified. So now you're working 23 hours, all right? You're no longer qualified, so you would be entitled to take advantage of COBRA coverage. And we'll talk about the mechanism of that. Other qualified events. What might be another one? Okay. Divorce. If you're no longer married. You may not be, many people are covered on their spouse's plan, okay? So if you're the spouse of the employee and you get divorced, well, that may be a qualifying event that drops you from coverage. And so you may be entitled to COBRA coverage at that point. Also termination, Amanda mentioned firing earlier, okay? Could be strikes, could be layoff, could be retirement. There is an exception for gross misconduct. Gross misconduct. And one case where we fought it and we lost it. And it doesn't bother me to lose. Sometimes we've lost cases. But this one bothered me because there was a forgery. And they said it's not gross misconduct. And I'm still, and let me be fair. It really wasn't for personal gain, but it was kind of, it wasn't a bank situation, but I'll use a banking situation. You can't tolerate, regardless of the reason, somebody in a bank signing a check that is not there, signing somebody else's name to a check, okay? Cannot tolerate it. And it was similar. It wasn't a banking situation, but very similar environment. And we terminated the person, or the client terminated the person because they had signed somebody else's name to that. Basically, the Department of Labor said, you know what? And we said, no, we're not going to give you COBRA benefits. Department of Labor said, no, you are going to give COBRA benefits because we've looked at this, and because it wasn't for personal gain, it's not gross misconduct. Yeah, okay. Maybe I can see that. I would hope that if they had gone so far as forgery and stealing, that would be gross misconduct. And I think they would have. So maybe I'm being a little harsh on them. Maybe it was just because of my closeness to the particular industry back then. But that was not gross misconduct. But if it is gross misconduct, you do not have to provide COBRA continuation coverage. Okay? Now, the other thing to keep in mind, you can have, and again, we can get really complicated. I don't want to get too complicated, but I think it's important to understand it. You can also have what is called a second qualifying event. Now, in order to have a second qualifying event, you have to first have a what? Yeah, there we go. This is fun. This is easy. All right. You have to have a first qualifying event. So let me give you the example where this may come into play. And it actually shows up a little more than you might think. You have a situation where somebody loses their job, okay? There's a layoff, all right? As a result of that layoff, the employee loses his job, but who else is going to lose, or loses his job, loses his coverage? Who else is going to lose their coverage? The spouse. All right? Now, you got the layoff, you got financial problems, you know where I'm going, what happens? They get divorced. Boy, yeah. Wow. They get divorced, and now we have what? A second qualifying event. Because the spouse, what was the spouse's first qualifying event? Huh? Yeah, when the husband lost his job, and I'm assuming it's female, I mean, it could be either way, but when the spouse lost their job, okay, then that was the first event that caused the spouse who was not employed, or not employed at that particular company, to lose their coverage, okay? And then when there was the divorce, it then became longer, okay? All right, basically you have with regard to COBRA coverage, give you, for the most part, how much time you get, okay? You are basically, with regard to employment termination or reduction, if there's an employment termination or reduction, you're required to provide COBRA coverage for up to 18 months. Okay, 18 months. If it is a divorce or legal separation, it's 36 months. So divorce or legal separation is 36 months. If you have a death of an employee, it's also 36 months. And if they're allowed to enroll in Medicare, the spouse situation. Let's say the husband enrolls in Medicare. As a result, the spouse loses that coverage that she or he had through the spouse. Then what you have is another 36 months. Okay. So generally, 18 months for termination, 36 months for death or divorce. Causing it. And what do I mean by 18 months? That means you can get COBRA coverage for another 18 months. They have to continue, the employer or the group plan has to continue to cover you for that period of time. Now, give you an example of that with regard to the secondary beneficiary or the secondary qualification. Let's say terminated employee have COBRA coverage for 18 months. During that period, the former employee dies. Now the spouse can get coverage increased from 18 to 36 months.
So it's just an increase?
It's just an increase. It's not a stackable. That is correct. Good, yeah, good point. It is not a stackable thing. Okay. Now, people say COBRA coverage is expensive. And the reason for that is because now the employee or the spouse, whoever the covered person, the beneficiary is, has to pay not only their premium, but what the employer was paying as well. The total cost can be up to 102%. And people say that's really expensive. What really happens is the cost of the coverage didn't really go up all that much. It's just that where the employer was paying 60%, 70%, 90% of it, now the employee is paying all of it. Okay, so it's expensive to the employee, but it's not that the cost shoots way up there, that the cost of the coverage has gone up. That's not the case. It's just a situation where the employee is having to pay for it, all of it, or the dependent is having to pay for all of it, as opposed to not paying for it. Basically what happens is when there is, and I won't get into all of the COBRA termination, but when there's an event, a qualifying event, you have to let the plan administrator know, you have to let the employer know. The employer, if it's a termination, has to let the proper people know. And basically the employee or that spouse has to be notified of their COBRA rights and that they have the right to elect COBRA coverage. Okay? And for the most part, and again, there's all kinds of little nuances that we could get into, but we won't. The employee or the spouse has 60 days to decide whether or not they're going to elect that coverage. Okay. For the most part, has 60 days. Now, how does that cost employers who fail to take care of what they're supposed to do? What we had was a situation once where employer failed to give COBRA notice. Fired employee failed to give the COBRA notice. We think they fired the employee. We had a whole slew of issues there, but we really think they fired him because of some health issues that were coming up. Fires the employee. As a result of firing the employee loses coverage, right? but the employer doesn't advance or doesn't provide the notification. So the employee doesn't get any coverage. Now goes out and incurs a bunch of medical bills, all right? And as a result of not getting the COBRA coverage, we went back after the employer and said, hey, you didn't provide the coverage, and the employer had to pay. So what they were trying to avoid in the first place came back to bite them, and really more so because they had to pay for it out of pocket as opposed to having to pay for it with health insurance or having their health insurance paid for it. Okay. Now, can people play with that 60 days? Sure. I mean, and I'll tell you, I did. When I left the ownership of the firm that I was member of, my job went. I mean, I left on one day and then starting the next day at Junkie Hammons Industries. Well, I wasn't covered for 30 days. Okay, but I had 60 days in order to elect coverage. So basically, what do? What happens? What kind of coverage do I get for that 30 days I'm not covered? No, I don't do anything because I wait and see. Okay? What happens if I don't get if I go on the new plan in 30 days, but I have 60 days to elect coverage and nothing happens? Why do I want to pay money? If something had happened in that 30 days, then would I have gone and got that COBRA? Yeah, I would have. But there was no reason to go out because I have how many days to get it? 60, but I'm going to be covered in 30. So I had a window of 30 that I could say, okay, I didn't have anything, and I'm going to know it. If I've got a serious health condition, and it doesn't have to be serious, if I've got anything that's going to trigger a health insurance premium or whatever, I'm going to know about it. Okay? And so you've got a little leeway within the system. All right? Everybody understand the basic of COBRA coverage? Jackie?
So is this going to be really messed with as far as the new healthcare policies coming in the next few years?
The answer to that question is yes. But don't ask me the follow-up to that question,
Alright.
which is how?
Oh, yeah.
Have not a clue.
Okay.
Have not a clue.
Because it seems like the purposes sort of overlap. Basically.
Drew, you and I are going to be back editing, and depending upon what happens.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, because depending upon who gets elected, it's going to depend upon who gets elected. I believe that. I mean, I may be wrong, but I believe it's going to depend upon who.
Taking this test before that, then.
Huh?
So I'm glad we're taking this test
Right,
before that, then.
right. Yeah, 2014 is going to be awful, and quite frankly, employers are looking. Is it cheaper to pay the fines that come in from certain things than it is to cover everybody? I mean, health insurance as we know it is going to be completely changed. And I have my personal views, and you can agree with them, and I may be wrong. It may not be, and I'm generally more optimistic and not a doomsayer, but I'm not real optimistic about what happened. But it's a great question, Jackie. It's all going to change. It's all going to change. And so you have to come back to the class again to see what happens in 2014. And I'll tell you, I don't know, because I won't know. Okay. All right. Any questions about COBRA coverage or family medical leave or any of that? All right, Gary, we can